Hi, how are you? It's Luna here from Barcelona, the host of the Spanish podcast Lunaticoin. I'm back again with an English podcast. It's been a while since I did the last one, but it is for a good reason, because today I'm speaking with SeedSigner, the creator of the hardware with the same name, SeedSigner. SeedSigner is an amazing project that has all the ethos of Bitcoin condensed in a do-it-yourself hardware wallet. The idea of the device is amazing. It is something that we as Bitcoiners really needed. And it's great, and SeedSigner will explain why he got this idea. But another part of the podcast that is amazing is his background. How he got into Bitcoin is one of those times that really makes sense to ask the famous question of how you got into Bitcoin's rabbit hole. As my Spanish podcast, this one is sponsored by HODL, the place to buy Bitcoin from other peers with total security and without KYC. Also by Bitrefill, the place where you can live with your Bitcoin. And Shift Crypto, producers of Bitbox 2, an amazing hardware wallet to store securely your Bitcoin. The best is in what SeedSigner has to explain, also because he's not butchering English as I do. So here is the story behind his amazing project, SeedSigner. Good morning, SeedSigner.
Morning, Luna. How are you?
I'm good. Here already afternoon, evening-ish. So yeah, ready to talk a little bit about what you've been working, because I'm really curious, and SeedSigner has been one of those projects that caught my interest from first moment, and it was not like a casual interest, like, okay, let's see what happened. No, I got super excited because I saw the potential from the very beginning of what it could be. And yeah, I'm a freak about control and about managing seeds and creating my own entropy when I'm doing a new seed. But then I was missing a piece. I was missing the checksum. Probably you, this was something that you had in head also. Then I was very happy when Spectre did their upgrade, but then I was still thinking that there was a missing piece, something like SeedSigner. I know I am a freak, but I am curious to know what is your background and what has been your Bitcoin path to be also kind of in the same level of technical Bitcoin freak.
Sure. So it goes back to I have kind of an interesting origin story with Bitcoin. So I am a retired law enforcement officer. I was just a local cop here in the States, and early on in my career, I was given the opportunity to join a digital forensic working group. So I was a cop for 15 years, but for 12 of those years, I worked in a digital forensic lab, taking apart computers and cell phones and hard drives, that sort of thing, and trying to help investigate and solve crimes and support prosecutions and that sort of thing. But anyhow, back to Bitcoin. So the first time I heard about Bitcoin was at work. And another examiner who worked in the same lab that I did was working on a case where there was a local teenager who had received kind of a high-end gaming computer for Christmas or their birthday or something like that. And this gaming rig had, a decent GPU and that sort of thing. And this is in late 2012, kind of during the heyday of GPU mining with Bitcoin. So this local kid would mine Bitcoins with this gaming rig that he had, and then he would go on the Silk Road, which I wasn't familiar with at the time, but he would go onto the Silk Road and buy marijuana and have that shipped to his house through the mail, and then he'd break the package into smaller units and take it to school and sell the weed for dollars. And that was an extremely clever and entrepreneurial way of earning a little money when you're a teenager. But this other examiner, as a part of the story, referenced this thing called Bitcoin. And I tried to do some Googling for it, and it didn't really make sense to me that people would be using, all of this compute with computers and GPUs to support it. At first, I thought, honestly, it was some sort of like, if you're familiar with SETI, the search for extraterrestrial life, how
Yep.
people donate compute cycles to that, or maybe like folding at home, or I thought it was some kind of huge password cracking engine. I didn't understand it at first. And I set it aside for a couple months and then revisited it in early 2013 and probably read a little bit more. And the second time I got it, and it was down the rabbit hole I went at that time.
That was early, yeah?
Early-ish. I'm sure there's a lot of people who were earlier, but I was on Bitcoin Talk, and this was just as ASICs were coming onto the scene. So on Bitcoin Talk, there were a lot of sales being organized. If you've ever heard of a company called Butterfly Labs, they were an early ASIC manufacturer. They're actually, oddly enough, on the other side of the state I live in, here in the United States. And I had an order with Butterfly Labs, and they had this, there was an ongoing joke because they were always late shipping their ASICs. And at this time, in the Bitcoin network, the difficulty is exploding. So when you pay money for an ASIC, the time it takes for it to be manufactured and to get to you, the difficulty is going up, and the profitability of it's going down and down. So people would hound this particular company, and they always would say that the ASICs would be shipping in about 2 weeks, or they'd be, ready in about 2 weeks. Orders would go out in about 2 weeks, and it became this big joke on the Bitcoin Reddit. But so I did some GPU mining in my basement with shitcoins and trading shitcoins and stuff like that. Actually mined some Bitcoin in my basement with GPUs, and then did a little bit of ASIC mining with some orders I got in on. But like I said, difficulty was just going crazy at the time. And I continued, to be a Bitcoiner in my off hours, after hours, and by day I was working my job, primarily working on crimes against children, and that was my daytime gig. But as a part of, so you kind of asked about my background with SeedSigner and how it may have gotten to this point. And a lot of people may not know a ton about digital forensics, but one of the things I was tasked with examining were cell phones. And cell phones are unique in digital forensics because a cell phone is designed to be connected to the network. That's the whole point, is that you can use it to talk on. And then they evolved into these, forever connected to the internet devices. Forensics on a computer is much simpler because you just pull out the hard drive, read the data off the hard drive, and you can have kind of the static state of what the state the device was in and the information that was on it. But cell phones, they're always collecting data. They're always sending data out to the network. And sometimes it's difficult to isolate those devices from the network, which is important to the forensic process because you don't want it to receive new information that might not be covered under your warrant, and you want to get the evidence into a more static state. So we actually had, where I was working, a large room, actually a small room called a Faraday enclosure. For Faraday enclosures, it was large because they're usually pretty small, but this was an actual closet that you could go into, and it has radio shielding built into the door and built into the ceiling, the walls all around you, so that you can go in there with a cell phone. And as soon as you close the door, the bars on your cell phone just drop to nothing. And that device operates in what we call radio isolation. And at that point, you can attempt to, pull data off the mobile phone or whatever you need to do with it. But I think the concept of digital forensics, I always jokingly with other people at work would call it adversarial computing, because you're always having to do work under the assumption that someone is either trying to hide something from you, or they're going to question your methods, or they're going to question your findings. And you always kind of have to be looking over your shoulder. And that's even more so with cell phones, because you have to make sure that you're conducting your analysis in isolation from the network. So in terms of private key management, it's actually kind of a similar concept, that you always want that private key to be isolated from any network, or even like, recently when I was generating some private keys, I was doing it with my son. And as we're doing it, I reminded him, like, we don't even say these words out loud because Siri's always listening. Alexa's always listening. There's always something listening. So this focus on security and isolation of sensitive data through forensics is probably kind of what created that context for me. I know that's a long-winded answer, but hopefully it hits at what you were getting at.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, no, and it's very interesting what you just explained. It's kind of like a wow, no, that somebody with this law enforcement background in the electronic forensics got into Bitcoin, and that explains a lot of why SeedSigner, no? Just let me ask you something that popped from listening to you. What do you think about hot wallets in cell phones right now with all this forensics background?
I think the security model it's interesting for something that you would keep a few $100s on. I certainly wouldn't trust it for any sort of long-term holding. But the trusted platform model that kind of follows, I think it's compelling for small to medium amounts of money, but security itself is always going to be a cat and mouse game. And when they started adding those trusted platform modules to cell phones, it made the job for people doing the kind of work that I was doing a lot more difficult, because encryption became, instead of an option that you could turn on, encryption became the default standard. It's super powerful, and I'm probably lean more on the libertarian side, so I think people should have the right to be private in their information. But what concerns me more about the trusted platform modules and integrating Bitcoin wallets into cell phones that way is what kind of access that gives the carriers or the manufacturers to, because there are some backdoors that companies like Samsung and others have to be able for users to reset passwords so that the manufacturer can assist with that process. But that can also, that just opens up the possibility of funds being able to be accessed or seized by a company or then a government, if a government had some sort of legal process that authorized a company to do that. I think it's super useful for small and medium amounts of money, but people really need best security practices if they're trying to protect a significant portion of their net worth. And just a device that is talking to the internet all the time, I think is just, there are inherently risks with that I wouldn't trust with a ton of money. Does that answer your question?
Sure, and it's very interesting. And the problem with Bitcoin, and I have experienced it myself during this last bull run, if we can call it like that, already, I suppose, is that you think that you have little money in your hot wallet, and after 1 month or two, it is a shitload of money on your hot wallet,
Right.
and then. I can imagine that this is what happened to people that had like 1,000 Bitcoin in blockchain.com, no, or and this kind of like web wallets, and yeah, they are okay with that, and they don't realize at some point what's the real value they are holding with a very bad security model. So, but yeah, Bitcoin makes you be constantly checking your security model, and also revisiting your hot and cold wallets to see what you have where. But going back to the main topic of the podcast, SeedSigner, that's how I'm calling you, but also is the name of the project, the device that you created in these last months, and that I am so excited about. But probably some people that is hearing doesn't know what is it. So how would you explain it? What is SeedSigner?
Right. SeedSigner is what I'll refer to as the software project that can run. So it's designed to run on a Raspberry Pi Zero, and it's a specific version of the Raspberry Pi Zero called a Zero 1.3 There are other versions like the Raspberry Pi W that have wireless, but what makes the 1.3 unique is that it doesn't have Bluetooth and it doesn't have Wi-Fi capabilities. So there's no way for it to wirelessly communicate with either of those protocols. But SeedSigner itself, at the most basic level, it's what I'd call a cryptographic signing device. It basically proves that it knows the private key, but it doesn't at any point actually share the private key. And what I'll again emphasize is that not only does it not share the private key, but because it doesn't have the ability to communicate wirelessly, it can't share the private key through those mediums.
Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to start working on SeedSigner? Like, what was the main idea that you were pursuing?
Right. The main idea, and if I can, I probably should digress a little bit. I probably didn't explain SeedSigner quite well enough beyond it just being a cryptographic signing device.
Mm-hmm.
So what it does with regards to Bitcoin is, so a user will typically have a 12 or 24. There's some other variations, but they'll typically have 12 or 24 words as a seed phrase, and those seed phrases are what their private key data is derived from. What SeedSigner does is it allows you to input those 12 or 24 words, and then you can then use the device to sign Bitcoin transactions. It also will do some things if you're trying to create a 12 or 24 word seed and you've used your own self-generated entropy to create the first 11 or the first 23 words. It will run a checksum algorithm that creates or tells you what the 12th or 24th word needs to be. It'll also let you roll dice 99 times, and it'll take the entropy that's generated from the dice, and it will create private key and then give you a seed phrase for that. So that's kind of a backwards way of describing it, but it does those four things. It'll calculate the last word of a seed phrase. It'll calculate a seed phrase with dice. It'll generate what's called an extended public key that allows you to set up a multi-signature wallet. And then it will sign Bitcoin transactions by proving that it knows private key data that it can communicate to a wallet software.
It is amazing because it makes you see the things. It makes you understand Bitcoin easy in a clearer way than you normally do. No, for example, I really like Colcar because it pushes users to learn Bitcoin. It pushes users to understand transactions, and that is not just magic like create and send. No, there is a creation, there is the signing of it, and then there is the broadcasting of it. So, and SeedSigner is for me another step because the Bitcoin protocol goes on and it's unstoppable. It has an uptime of 99.98% in these 12 years. And then you have your private keys, that mostly they are in the shape of a seed. But those, even I've heard many people that says you don't need if you don't trust your hardware wallet, like delete your seed from there and just store it properly. Use passphrases, and there is other methods to be sure about the security of your seed. But then if you think about it, you have a paper or a metal steel seed, and you have a protocol, and you need something in between to interact. No, it's like an analog wall and digital wall, and SeedSigner is like the perfect tool to connect those two realities. No, is this tool in between. And then I have this is maybe more a philosophical question, but do you see it also as a tool, or do you understand it also as a hardware wallet? Like maybe it's also like a word game, what I'm asking you here, no? Because it could be considered both. But I would like to know your opinion on this.
Right. It becomes a little bit of a semantic thing, but I think this model creates some new distinctions between what I'd call private key storage and then the act of signing itself, and then more of a wallet function that builds transactions and broadcasts them out to the network and tracks balances that you're keeping and that sort of thing. So you have the private key storage element, which is more, however you're deciding to store your seed phrase. So whether it's on crypto steel or written down on a piece of paper or whatever security precautions you're taking, and then you have private key storage, but then you have, like you're kind of alluding to, this thing in the middle that's a signing device that really just proves to the wallet software that the correct private key information is known. So it does kind of exist in the middle, and I have to give credit. I'm not sure if Spectre DIY was the first software to come up with that model, or maybe it was Cobalt or something before. But that is what inspired me to start exploring this model even further. When I first heard of, I was listening to a Stefan Levere podcast, and he was interviewing a gentleman called Michael Flaxman, who had written.
I heard that one.
Right. Yeah, it's a great episode. And if you're looking to, store some Bitcoin over the long term and really maximize your security, Michael's written this thing called the 10x Bitcoin Security Guide. And it just has all these great insights into generating your own entropy and how to set up a multisig wallet and best practices and that sort of thing. So I listened to that episode and heard about Spectre Desktop through that episode. And so I started looking at Spectre, and then I found their GitHub repository for Spectre DIY. And I'm personally not a huge do-it-yourself hardware person, but I was taken by the idea of the Spectre DIY. It made sense to me immediately, kind of similar to what you're talking about, that device in the middle between your private key and the wallet that keeps those two things separate to maintain kind of the highest degree of security. So, I ordered the parts and went through the GitHub and built one myself. And that first time that I signed a Bitcoin transaction using Spectre Desktop and QR codes with the QR scanner, and then showing the QR codes to my laptop's web camera, it was just about as magical to me as the first time I sent a Bitcoin transaction, or the first time that I sent a Lightning transaction. It just clicked in a very intuitive sort of way. To have that kind of control over the private key and the device it was on, and knowing that was isolated from your wallet software, it was just so that's what got my imagination running with the SeedSigner project, was to see how simple of hardware you could maybe run that on. And it kind of all came together from a few different angles. I was exchanging some DMs with Michael, the guy who created the 10x Bitcoin Security Guide, and part of his security guide is this website called Seed Picker, and it's an open source project that helps you calculate the final word of a seed phrase after you've introduced your own entropy to it. And he kind of threw out, it'd be really neat to get some code together that ran this seed picker type algorithm on a Raspberry Pi Zero 1.3, that very specific version that I mentioned before that doesn't have any wireless capabilities. He said it'd be neat to, throw some controls together with a little screen, and that way you could calculate your final word in your seed with the knowledge that your seed hadn't been exposed to the internet or any sort of wireless or anything like that. And so I ordered a Raspberry Pi Zero, and I ordered the particular display with the controls that he had kind of thrown out there. And I had taken some programming when I was younger, and Raspberry Pis they kind of have Python baked into them. So I started studying up on Python, and it was just like a baby steps process of, can I get it to do this on the command line? Can I get some demo code to run on this screen? Can I get it to accept, user input through the buttons in the joystick? Can I get the alphabet to display on the screen and spell out words? And it was just this very incremental step-by-step process of what's possible with this software. But the first step was just, with SeedSigner, was just getting it to that point where you could enter 23 words and it would run a script that would calculate the 24th word.
It is amazing. It is amazing because I said at the beginning that I wanted to know your story because I consider myself like a freak of these technicalities, and sometimes not understood by anybody. Like why I believe it's so important to create your own entropy when there is hardware wallets that create them already, and probably you can fuck up if you don't have a good source of entropy and so on. And then I got very interested about SeedSigner, but also the funny part is that I also got very interested about this Stefan Libera podcast with Flaxman,
Hmm.
and after that I was in contact with people at Spectre, and I explained like exactly the same. So at the same moment, I was having also the same thoughts, like we need something offline that we can calculate the checksum. And even that's why I opened the issue in Spectre, so to ask them, please, like, hey, it would be amazing that you have this tool to calculate the last word, no, of a seed, so I can do it fully offline. And I love SeedSigner because it, like, of course, the Spectre now, after that, Kobo introduced the same functionality. Now Bitbox has also something similar, so it became very fast like a tool that everybody wants to have in their hardware wallet. But the cool thing of SeedSigner is that you can do it like very affordable and yourself, and in the process you can learn a lot of Bitcoin. uh, maybe can I ask you, like, how much can it cost to construct a SeedSigner as minimum?
Right, and that was part of the driving force of what motivated me to get the project up and running. Was a lot of times in Bitcoin, there's this narrative that Bitcoin is going to help people from less advantaged economies to be able to save in a currency that's not their own local currency that might be being debased. And there's just this ongoing narrative that Bitcoin is a tool of economic empowerment for people that are less economically advantaged. But if you talk about setting up a multisig setup with conventional hardware wallets, so and maybe you'd mix manufacturers, or maybe you just buy a single manufacturer. Best practice is to mix them, but for each one of those, for a Cobalt Vault, or for a Ledger, or for a Trezor, I don't know what the prices are, but they're about $100 a piece. Is that still kind of the standard? Yeah. So if you want to
Yeah.
set up even a simple, 2 of 3 multi-sig setup, you're going to be spending $300, $400, $500 just to get the hardware in your hands to be able to make it happen. And so part of what was motivating me with SeedSigner was to see how much we can drive down the cost of a signing device that eliminates the need for the multiple hardware wallets. So maybe you could generate your own seeds with your own entropy, that the cost for that is marginal to nothing. And then if you're just using a signing device that doesn't remember the seeds, you can take those seeds and give them to trusted third parties, or put them in a safe deposit box, or memorize it in your head, whatever secure locations you find. But then you would just need this one device to be able to communicate your private key, to be able to sign transactions with whatever wallet software you're using. In this case, it's Spectre that works with SeedSigner. But to get back to your question about the cost of the components, so you have a Raspberry Pi Zero, and that's that 1.3 version. On the internet, I think about $10 is the average. We have a local store close to me called Micro Center that's a chain here in the States, and you can actually buy that Pi Zero 1.3 for $5. They'll sell you one of them for $5, and then after that, if you want to buy more, they're $10 each. So you have the Raspberry Pi for $10, let's say, and then I use a very specific LCD and control module that's made by a company called WaveShare. That costs $13 or $14. You're probably going to pay some shipping with that as well. And then the third component is a very inexpensive camera that's compatible with Raspberry Pi and Raspberry Pi Zero, which if you order those through AliExpress or a platform like that, you can get them for a few bucks, but I would expect to pay between $5 and $10 for the camera. And then you have, a memory card, we'll say $3 or $4. I think that's bringing us up pretty close to $35 once you factor in shipping and stuff. But, for $35 with the free software on the GitHub, you get the whole shebang to where you can manage and, virtually infinite number of private keys with just that one device.
And a journey into Bitcoin, into learning Bitcoin that no other cheap hardware wallet in the market will give you. That for sure.
Right. And I love that you kind of touched on it before, but I have to give huge credit to Stefan and Moritz and Ben over at Spectre Desktop and Spectre DIY, because one of the things I love about Spectre is that, as far as I know, it requires you to run your own node. And that's a journey that I think, a lot of people in the world who interact with the Bitcoin network don't, but I think there's huge value in that. And I love the node projects. I personally have my node is the particular software that I'm using, but yeah, I love that Spectre requires you to have your own node. And then I think, some of these tools that kind of, I don't want to say force you to create your own seed, but they kind of channel you in that direction, because sometimes, we as human beings can be lazy and we just need kind of that nudge in the right direction.
Yeah, you're right. Responsibility and being sovereign, it costs time and a little bit of effort. And of course, if you give it, I don't know, a ledger, a Trezor, I mean, it's fair. If you want that convenience is there, but then the trade-off at the end is security, because you are missing the many points in when you are signing a transaction and so on. You are missing steps, and that's why using Spectre hardware wallet, let's say, and SeedSigner, you need to forget what you learn and learn again. The same with Coldcard. You need to forget what you were used to when you were using Ledger, and to learn again, basically the right way to learn how Bitcoin works.
Sure.
You just released, I mean, you have been working a lot lately, so maybe since I've been checking, maybe you release some other update. But the last one, at least, that I installed was the version 0.3.0. And for me has been a huge upgrade. Could you explain what can you do right now with SeedSigner?
Right. Version 0.3 was a big upgrade from there was some discrepancy in the previous version. It was either 0.1 or 0.2, depending on whether you looked on GitHub or on the device. But that first version was just kind of like a proof of concept of, hey, we can sign transactions with this thing. And version 0.3 really built in some improvements to the process. One of the things I added was the ability to accommodate 12-word seeds in addition to 24-word seeds, just because that's the format that some people prefer. There's some error checking that's now built into the seeds, whereas before, if you entered an invalid seed, the device would crash and you'd have to restart it to work it again. Now there's error handling for that. There's just a lot of UX improvements in terms of when you're working with Spectre and it's displaying the QR frames. On SeedSigner, you get on the display kind of a tracker that tracks which frames of an animated QR that you're scanning in as you go. In the previous version, there were just a lot of times where maybe the device would pause for a few seconds and it was doing something in the background, but as a user, you didn't have very good intuition as to, did it lock up or is it calculating next pub or signing a transaction or whatnot. So the latest version, I'm probably missing some stuff that it improved upon, but the latest version has reached, I wouldn't call it a plateau, but it's at a point where it's a viable signing device. Oh, we also added testnet in the last version, which is something that people had kind of very validly been asking for. The initial one, like I mentioned, was kind of a proof of concept, but to be able to validate the device and use it in a testing scenario, it was really important to get it onto testnet. And another improvement that I'm thinking of is actually trimming down the partially signed transactions. So when the workflow typically works with SeedSigner in that when you first power on the device, you're going to input a seed. The easiest way to do it is to input the seeds and save them temporarily on a device. When I say save, it's just saving it within the program running. It's not writing anything to the memory card or anything like that. But it has the ability to temporarily remember up to 3 seeds. And if you're going to be using a seed more than once, like to set up a wallet and then conduct some test transactions, you'll want to go into the settings and first set it up for testnet or mainnet, and then you can go to the seed tools and you can enter up to 3 seeds that it's going to remember temporarily while the device is powered on. When you power it off, the program shuts down and those seeds go away with memory. So the typical user flow is you'll enter either 12 or 20 forward seeds into the 2 or 3 slots, and then you'll create, I realize I should explain this because a lot of people may not even have seen air gap signing. And then you're going to generate what's called an extended public key from that seed data. And the extended public key is what the wallet software that you're using to coordinate the multisig setup. The extended public key is kind of the public representative of the private key that allows the wallet software to get the wallet set up and to create addresses and create transactions and such. And the way that that extended public key is communicated to Spectre in this case is through, on SeedSigner, 2 QR codes that are displayed to Spectre. And I have to give, again, Stepan and everybody working on Spectre credit because they kind of set up a platform that it just worked. Because the challenge with SeedSigner is that the screen is small and there's only so much data that you can pack into a QR code before. The more data you put into it, the smaller the grid of QR squares gets. And it can quickly get to the point where the resolution on the screen doesn't support the information, and you're not going to be able to scan it in to Spectre. So they do this very clever thing where you break the QRs into what's called an animated QR. And all that means is that it displays a sequence of QR codes that are in a specific order, and they each contain a bit of information. And once, like say Spectre Desktop in this case, has collected all the pieces of the QR codes, it reassembles the data inside of them. And that's how it either ingests a signed transaction or it ingests an extended public key. So I'll backtrack. You have your seeds in SeedSigner. You're communicating your extended public key to Spectre. You set up your wallet, and then you want to sign transactions. And this was what I originally started with. That was another important optimization that went into this version was, so Spectre Desktop is going to build what's called a partially signed Bitcoin transaction. And that is what it's going to communicate to SeedSigner. It's the same process, but just in the reverse. So Spectre will display these animated QR codes on the screen. And SeedSigner, when it's integrated with a camera, the camera ingests each of those QR code frames, and then it parses the information in the transaction. And it will show you information like the fee you're paying, what address that the transaction is going to, the amount of the transaction, just the basic information so that you can verify it's correct on the device. But then when you want to communicate the signatures back to Spectre, you need to do that via QR codes. Well, there's no need to communicate the rest of the transaction back to Spectre, like, you know, the fee that you're paying or some of the other. You really just want to communicate the signed keys back into Spectre. So what SeedSigner did that reduced a transaction that would have taken up to like 40 or 50 QRs, reduces it to maybe, you know, a half a dozen QRs that you have to send back into Spectre. So that was a long-winded way of explaining just it was a really important optimization in terms of usability, because the screen being so small on the SeedSigner, it it can be cumbersome to communicate the data back into Spectre via QR codes because there's only so much space on that screen. So being able to trim the transactions down made a huge difference in terms of usability. I think I went off on a couple tangents there.
No, I think it was great, and I just wanna like push the idea that SeedSigner is the cheapest device you can construct on your own. Is a DIY device. It, is the cheapest air gapped tool that will connect, that will create out of 24 words that you have on a paper in an analogic world. It will convert that into an XPub that can talk with Spectre Desktop, and that in a safe way, so that you don't have to be thinking, okay, but this is over cable, so and this is a very cheap device. Is it for sure not saying also my private key to the computer and then to the internet? So really, is the cheapest way you can go from paper storage or metal storage, cold storage, the coldest you can get of your seed, and translate it into something that can talk to the Bitcoin protocol and all air gap. And for me, I'm still amazed that you started from so, like, even learning bit by bit how to introduce the words on the device. And that right now I have here next to me, I have it in my hand right now, my SeedSigner, and that I have used it and I have tested. And I can say that, yeah, that it works, and it works amazing for what it has to do.
I have to give, huge credit to Stepan Snigarev, who's over at Spectre. He's also written an open source library for Python called mbit that saves developers like me a lot of the heavy lifting cryptographically of doing the hard math of signing transactions and whatnot. It's really an amazing tool and a super powerful tool to be able to interact with the Bitcoin network when you just have a functional knowledge of Python. And I can't say enough in terms of his building that tool and putting out there, but also being receptive to questions about it. And from somebody who's still getting up to speed on the Bitcoin protocol and understanding some of the nuances of the scripting language, he's been super receptive and very helpful. I can't emphasize that enough. He deserves a lot of credit for that Python library.
He does, but also you deserve credit. So just to not, I have to mention it because probably you will not say it about yourself. I want to know, like, what comes next? What comes next? What's in your mind for what are you working in now?
Right. So the big push right now is the three components: the camera and the Raspberry Pi Zero, and the little screen. And this little screen, if people haven't seen it, it's set up like a video game system where it has like a joystick device on the left-hand side, and it has three buttons on the right. It's like something you'd see on like a video game controller to play Mario or something like that. It's kind of an awkward little device in terms of its shape. And when you put the Raspberry Pi and the screen together with the camera, you have kind of this awkward stack of components. And I was trying to figure out the best way to get them into a single package so that, you don't have to worry about it being dropped so much or damaged or, push. You don't want to always be handling the circuit board. You want something that looks a little nicer and protects the components. And it's this awkward little bundle of devices that I was trying to make kind of lemons into lemonade. And I came up with this idea of what I'm calling the orange pill. So it takes this kind of elongated set of devices, and the enclosure I've created kind of looks like a little pill. And a lot of Bitcoiners will be familiar with, the orange pill process of people learning Bitcoin, drawing on like the matrix and the idea of being red pilled, in this case, orange pilled. At any rate, so I'm in the process of putting the final touches on this orange pill enclosure. that I hope to, within the next week or two, be offering for sale to people that are building these devices themselves and may have a need to, have some sort of enclosure to keep all the components together, to make it something more viable, to just throw, wherever you're keeping your trusted devices, you can throw it, in a drawer or a shoebox or in a safety deposit box or something like that, and to be able to come back to it. So an interest prior to this of mine was also 3D printing. So the enclosure that I'm designing will be manufactured with a couple of different 3D printing processes, and the end result is it's shaped like an orange pill, and it looks very similar to like a tiny video game device with the controls and the screen there. So I'm hoping to offer that for sale within the next couple of weeks to kind of help support some of the ongoing development. Beyond that, once I get some feedback about the enclosure, the biggest pain point I see with SeedSigner right now is boot time on the device, because it's running on, they call it a headless Raspberry Pi operating system. So it doesn't have a graphical user interface, but it still has the full Raspberry Pi operating system running behind it. So when you first apply power to the device, it takes about 90 seconds for it to start. And I totally acknowledge that is a pain point. It's not a huge deal if you put power to it and go get a cup of coffee or grab a glass of water and come back. And once it's up, it works fine. But that initial startup is a pain point. It'd be much better if it started up quicker. So I'm looking at some other much smaller, minimalistic distributions of operating systems, Linux operating systems that are compatible with Raspberry Pi, to hopefully get that boot time down to less than 10 seconds is ideally what I'd like to get to. I think if I can get the boot time down to less than 10 seconds with the current feature set, at that point, it's something that I'd be comfortable offering, for sale as an assembled device. But like I said, there are a couple things that need to happen before we get to that point.
I think that the worst of the initial startup time, I don't think it's terrible. The worst part is, like, as it is a DIY device, that you think you have messed something in the way. Because I remember this happened to me like twice. Even I was like, oh my God, I messed it. And then I was taking the micro SD card out and then I don't know how to say the word, but like reinstalling the firmware again, because I thought that there was something wrong, that I failed with the balena etcher to do it right. And that, I think that it was even a moment that, as you said, I went like, not for a coffee, I went for the toilet, or I went somewhere else that it took me longer than those 90 seconds, and it was plugged in. And when I came back, it was like working. I was like, oh, wow, it works. So I think that maybe the biggest problem of that is the knowledge of it, that you are lost, that you don't know if you did everything right or not. But when you know it, I mean, yeah, it makes sense that it can be a part to get better, but it's not that bad. It's not that bad.
If I could, just to give your listeners a sense of what the assembly requires to get one together.
Sure.
Probably the biggest challenge is that these Raspberry Pi Zero 1.3s and the Raspberry Pi Zeros, which are the smallest version of Raspberry Pi you can get. Most people are familiar with the larger squarish boards. This is more rectangular and it's a little bit smaller, but it has to have what are called GPIO pins installed on it, and GPIO stands for, I think, General Input Output, something to that effect. But it allows you to connect peripheral devices to the Raspberry Pi, and it uses those pins to be able to communicate with a secondary device, like in this case, the screen and the buttons. So it's really hard to find the Raspberry Pi 1.3 with the pins installed. So most of the people that are building them are having to attach the pins themselves. There's a couple ways to do it. The first is if you don't know how to solder already, is to learn how to solder. It sounds intimidating, but with a couple of YouTube videos, I'd really encourage people I've talked to a couple people privately that had never soldered before in their life, and they bought an inexpensive soldering iron for $5. There's a store in the States called Harbor Freight that sells very inexpensive tools. With a very inexpensive soldering iron, you can attach the pins yourself. Or there's a SeedSigner Telegram group that we also have, and one of the users, and they're located another device that you can find on Amazon or elsewhere that allows you to attach those GPIO pins to the Raspberry Pi Zero with a hammer and a special set of pins that they sell. From what I understand, people have had pretty good results with that. But that's probably the hardest thing, is getting the pins onto the Raspberry Pi Zero. And from that point, it's just a matter of attaching the screen, and then the camera goes. You have to have a very specific ribbon cable that works with Raspberry Pi Zeros. But attaching once you're familiar with how the camera and the ribbon cable attach, that's relatively simple. But like you said, I still have it. I built, a brand new SeedSigner the other night, new components that I'd ordered in the mail to do some testing with the enclosure for fitting it. And I hadn't yet powered it on. I'd just done the soldering and attached the camera. And there's that moment when you plug it in and the screen illuminates a little bit, and you're going to have to wait for a minute, but you're wondering, like, did I do the soldering right? Did I maybe, not insert the camera right? So once you see that first time and it lights up, it's it's a relief, and it works pretty reliably after that. But like you said, leap of faith.
Yeah, and there is this other version. I didn't solder anything. I used like a hammer version that you have like pins that end up like a needle. I don't know, maybe you have the better word, like the hole of a needle. They are in one end. Then you hammer and then it does the same work as soldering, but without soldering. So I use that. I was afraid of soldering, and it works. And it's great. And maybe you have to invest $10 more in this tool. I think I bought it in Primoroni or something like that. I will put the link in the description. But yeah, I mean, there is ways. And of course, this is a DIY device. So you assume when you are doing it that you will have to do things. It's not. So if you accept that, that's really it's no brainer. It's easy. It's not something that for example, once in 2011 I tried to construct like one of the first Prusas, the 3D printer machines, and that I bought the parts from China, and I tried to build it. That was also DIY, and that was impossible to build for my knowledge. I tried it and I failed completely. It was I have it as a I don't know, as a memory of my failure. But no, this is easy and very interesting. Like something you can do on a Saturday morning and enjoy your free time.
And I mentioned it. I think I know I mentioned that we have a Telegram group, and I'm sure there'll be information in the show notes. But there's, I think, over 50 people in that Telegram group, and they're for the most part pretty enthusiastic. And if somebody is trying to put one together and has questions, like, it's a great resource for other people that have done it, and can steer you in the right direction. Is there a moment that you think you will consider the SeedSigner finished? I don't know about finished, but I could see a point where development could plateau, or features might not be augmented for a while. It's something that as we've kind of talked about, I didn't set out to build. And I'd heard people talk about in the past that you kind of, when you have an idea for something and you want it to exist and you can see it in your imagination, it kind of becomes a mini obsession to bring that thing into reality. I didn't set out to build this, but it was kind of like a disease. Once it got into my mind, I had to bring it into a reality. And I think there are some definite optimizations, like I've mentioned, but at some point development may plateau. I don't see a huge need for it to do much beyond the helping with creating a seed and then interacting with a hardware wallet. One thing I could see is expanding support to other multi-signature coordination software sets. Like I think I haven't used it yet, but there's one called Nunchuck that I'm curious about, and Caravan I think does basically the same thing, though I don't know if they support air gapped. So support for other software, maybe something that could come. There are some different directions for it to grow, but I'm also hoping that over time other people get excited about it too, and people with some programming knowledge will help on the GitHub and help kind of add some of those features. Yeah.
Nice. I have only 2 questions before finishing. One is out of my curiosity, because we have many hardware wallet producers. So we have Ledger. I know they are over 200 employees working there. Trezor, I know, also is big. And then we have Bitbox and Shift, CoinKite, and many others. You have done SeedSigner on your own. Of course, I know you've said it a few times that Stepan has been there helping, and of course it's like never fully alone, but you know what I mean, mostly alone. And I'm curious about what do you think about these commercial hardware wallets? Do you think they could do more? Do you think they are, some of them, in a situation that they are comfortable even selling like devices that they are not the most advanced ones, but they are more in the money mindset? Or what's your idea? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
One of my thoughts is that air gapped is here to stay, and that's something that maybe not everybody, but a certain set of Bitcoiners and people looking to store coins securely are going to demand, whether it's in a DIY device, or I think that you're going to start to see some of the manufacturers incorporate that into their offerings. And I think once you get turned on to air gap, a lot of people are going to look at that wire that's connecting, the Trezor to their computer, or they're going to look at the ledger that's plugged into a USB port, or whatever. However the hardware wallet is connected to your computer, they're going to be looking at that wire, wondering what's going over that wire. Because once you kind of understand, it's just a human curiosity, and it's a point of failure. You don't know what's going over that wire. And so air gapped is really like it gives you a whole new level of peace of mind in terms of what's being accessed, where your seeds are being stored, and what kind of information the device is relaying. And I also think that as a result of, Ledger recently had the compromise, and I think that people are going to start to demand hardware wallets with a little less vendor interaction. Like I don't have experience with all the platforms, but I know that like with Trezor, if you're using a Trezor in just the conventional way that most users would use it, you have to interact with their servers, and that's how you manage your wallet. I think we may see the wallet space drifting away from that, where there are going to be more sovereign solutions that require less interaction with the manufacturers, because like Ledger demonstrated it's unfortunately, it's a point that can be compromised, and the space is just going to grow and mature over time. So those are just a couple things that I see developing.
That's the good part. The good part of DIY devices. No, at the end you're buying Raspberry and hardware that you could use for anything, and then you are good on on any data leakage, because they can leak that you bought a Raspberry, but that's nothing related with Bitcoin. So I also think that that's also a good point to look in the future for DIY devices. Last question I have is, with this your mindset and way of thinking about Bitcoin, I am curious to know, like, if you have any other project that you are interested in now in the Bitcoin scene.
I don't really have anything that I'm watching. I got into Spectre and the Spectre DIY and then eventually SeedSigner because I had a very specific problem that I needed solved, and I really think Spectre did that in an elegant way. So I'm probably woefully ignorant of some of the other DIY projects out there, but I'm open to learning. Are there any projects, other ones that you know about that you're watching that you're excited about?
Me?
Yep.
Anything that is related with Spectre, I'm in. And anything that that pushes like sovereignty. I don't even know how to pronounce this, but yeah, you understand me, I suppose. And
Yeah.
and the
Oh,
audience
absolutely.
too.
Sovereignty. Yeah.
Yeah, sovereignty. Yeah, that sounds better. The same. In general, I'm very like I became technical over time, but I also want to see like things getting easier for newcomers, so that at the end, I don't know, I have many family and friends that in this bull run are getting in, and sometimes after a few questions, I push the idea like, no, like download even a hot wallet like Samurai and this kind of thing, write your word. But really after half an hour of listening to them and their complaints and so on, I say, hey, look, what you want. If you want to go to a centralized exchange, because even afterwards they come to me and they say, hey, you told me that this was safe, but I don't find my words. And say, hey, look, like people need to start to be more responsible and less asking for everybody else to fix their problems. So I think that anything also that helps newcomers, I'm very interested in. But yeah, that caught me off guard. I don't even know what to say now about what I think no, I can say like output descriptors is something I am very interested in seeing how they develop in an easy way. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will stay in the shape and they are right now, or maybe they will end up being a huge QR code. I don't know. But I'm very interested because it is really something that can change the way we understand Bitcoin. I mean, like if you can really be flexible in writing, in placing any script in a Bitcoin transaction, that can open the creativity of wallet developers. And as you will have output descriptors, then you can store safely, all those weird scripts that then people will be able to do. So that can be something to look in the future. And I know that that's very core because it's very deep, but I think that can change a lot in what we see right now in Bitcoin in a more interesting use cases. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited to see more things built on top of Bitcoin in terms of some of the more complex smart contract sort of things. I'd love to see a lot of that come back.
Yeah. I said it at the beginning. You were since 2013. That's for me early. I started in 2017. So falling in the rabbit hole was quite a hard thing for me because I felt I needed to learn a lot fast. I think I did. I'm happy for that effort I did. But yeah, with you with such a perspective from 2013, I'm sure that you have to have like a very interesting point of view in how are things going and maybe how they should or not. So, but yeah, just to wrap up here, SeedSigner, it was an unbelievable, very interesting talk. I knew it would be interesting, but I've been very comfortable. I think I told you outside the podcast, like English is not my main language. I suppose everybody can see, but I feel very comfortable, and I really enjoyed listening to your whole story and background. and very happy to see how things are developing in SeedSigner. So thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and share some of my story and hopefully get some people interested to explore Spectre and air gap signing and maybe build something themselves.
Here, the Spanish Armada will keep pushing SeedSigner because we love it. So yeah, count on that help.
Well, I appreciate that.